I've always relied on routine to keep me steady. The hum of my rig's engine, the scent of black coffee in my thermos, and the predictable glow of the sunset in my side mirror. But one evening, routine gave way to dread. I was driving a well-known desert route at dusk, expecting an easy trip over the next 100 miles. The sky was a brilliant orange when I spotted a mangled car on the shoulder. Its taillights flickered as if gasping for life. My first instinct was to help. Truckers have an unspoken code about roadside emergencies. I pulled over, stepped out, and immediately sensed something was off. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the wind sifting sand across the asphalt. The driver's side door of the car was ajar. Peeking inside, I found the seats slashed and the radio sputtering static. No sign of the driver. No blood, no footprints. Just absolute emptiness. That's when I noticed the scratch marks along the roof and hood of the car. They weren't random scrapes from a collision. They looked like claw marks, jagged, parallel grooves cut deep into the metal. The kind of damage you can't easily explain with a simple crash. A lone shoe lay in the dirt near the front tire. Something had happened here, something violent or unearthly. I shouted, "Hello? Anybody?" But all I heard was the echo of my voice across the sand. A shape flickered in my peripheral vision. I whipped my flashlight around, heart pounding. For the briefest moment, it caught a glint of eyes reflecting back at me from behind a cactus. Then, just as fast, the reflection vanished. Every hair on my neck stood on end. Was it an animal, a person, or something else entirely? Reluctantly, I hurried back to my rig. I planned to radio it in, get the authorities involved. But as I turned the key, my headlights illuminated something crossing the road up ahead. Tall, thin, impossibly fast. In 2 strides, it disappeared behind a rocky outcrop. My engine sputtered as if it too was afraid. Finally, it roared to life. Fighting a wave of chills, I pulled onto the road, pushing the accelerator harder than usual. In my mirror, that battered car and the windy desert shoulders faded into the evening gloom. I did call the police once I found a signal, but they seemed skeptical. The operator asked me if I was sure about what I saw. I could only recount the scene, the marks, the flicker of those eyes, the unearthly shape crossing the highway. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. It's been weeks now, and no official report has surfaced. No mention of a missing driver or anything unusual. Yet, every time I pass through that stretch, my heart races. I scan the roadside for that twisted wreck or another pair of glowing eyes in the dark. Sometimes, all I see is emptiness. But once in a while, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving swiftly against the backdrop of sunset. Something that doesn't belong to this world, leaving me wondering just how close I came to its clutches that night. Driving cross-country has perks, but one downside is the unpredictable times you need to stop. When nature calls at 3 a.m., you don't have much choice. I found a small rest stop off a rarely used highway, just a single building with flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by thick pines. My gut told me it wasn't ideal, but I had no alternative. I parked near the building, the only vehicle in sight. A rickety soda machine hummed by the entrance. Inside, the restroom was dimly lit. One of the bulbs buzzed overhead, threatening to go out. I washed my hands, looked up into the mirror, and almost jumped out of my skin. Behind me stood a man, silent, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He offered no greeting, just stared. Heart pounding, I forced a nod. "How's it going?" No reply. His expression was unreadable. I dried my hands, trying not to show how unsettled I was. That's when I noticed his clothes were oddly dated, like from a different decade. Maybe an eccentric drifter? I tried leaving, but he stepped aside in a slow, deliberate way that felt more threatening than polite. Once outside, I realized something was definitely off. The building was deserted. No attendant, no other travelers. I hastened to my rig. The stranger followed at a slow pace, the gravel crunching under his boots. A primal instinct told me, "Lock your doors." Now, I got in, locked the doors, and turned the key. The headlights flicked on, illuminating him just a few feet away. He raised a hand and gently touched the hood. I froze. I could see his face clearly for the first time. Ashen, eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. Or was he even alive? Slowly, he pressed both palms against the grille as if testing its warmth. Then, with a swift jerk, he slammed his fist against the hood. The sound thundered through the cab. I fumbled to throw the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel. He stared, unwavering, as I backed away. I didn't look back after that, accelerating down the road without caution. My heart hammered in my throat. 10 minutes later, I risked a glance in the mirror. The rest stop was just a tiny glow in the distance, the figure nowhere in sight. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd see him again, that he might manifest at another lonely stop. I've told this story to other truckers. Some say it's just a vagrant. Others mention rumors of a ghost hitchhiker on that highway, a restless soul who died decades ago. Either way, I avoid that particular rest stop at all costs. Even now, when I pass the turn-off sign, I feel a prickle on my arms and a memory of that stranger's hollow eyes glaring at me in the fluorescent light. Winter hauls are the worst. The threat of snow, sub-zero winds, and black ice is enough to keep any sane driver on edge. I'd been driving for hours through a remote mountainous area, racing to deliver a load before an approaching storm. The radio weatherman predicted heavy snow by midnight, so my plan was to beat the clock. Around 10 p.m., tiny snowflakes started dancing across my windshield. The road was slick but manageable. Then, without warning, I hit a patch of black ice on a narrow bend. The truck fishtailed. My trailer swung wide, nearly toppling me into a ravine. With a frantic series of corrections, I managed to regain control, skidding to a stop just inches from the guardrail. Shaken, I realized I needed a break. Up ahead was a small clearing. I pulled over, heart still hammering. Snow fell harder, the wind howling like a wounded animal. I radioed dispatch. Static. No signal. In the swirling snow, I glimpsed a faint glow deeper in the woods. Maybe a cabin or a ranger station? Figuring I could call for assistance, I left the truck's engine running to keep the cabin warm and grabbed a flashlight. The crunch of my boots on fresh snow made me wince at how loud it sounded. The darkness pressed in, the trees forming tall silhouettes. That glow flickered like a lantern or candlelight. After trudging about 100 yards, I found a small cabin with a single lit window. Relieved, I knocked. No answer. I tried the door. It creaked open. Inside was dim and cramped, with old furniture strewn about. A lantern on a table cast dancing shadows on the walls, but nobody was there. Then I saw a set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow by the threshold, leading in but not out. My pulse quickened. Where did they go? Something thumped from behind a closed door in the corner. My first thought, maybe the occupant was hurt. I gently pushed the door. It revealed a bedroom with a sagging bed. Empty. Another thump, this time from the main room. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. Just that flickering lantern. I can't explain the wave of dread that gripped me. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing me to leave. The wind outside grew fiercer, making the cabin's wooden beams groan. I decided to grab the lantern, hoping it might help me find whoever needed aid. But when I reached for it, the lantern extinguished by itself, snuffed out as if by invisible fingers. Darkness swallowed me, and I fumbled for my flashlight. In its beam, I saw fresh footprints near the door, beside my own. Yet, I'd heard nobody enter. Terror surged. I backed out of the cabin, every nerve on fire, certain I wasn't alone. Snow stung my face as I nearly sprinted to my truck. Once inside, I locked the doors, jammed the heater to max, and tried to calm my trembling hands. I never found the occupant of that cabin. As soon as my truck was stable enough, I continued down the mountain. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those footprints or the unseen presence that seemed to follow me inside. They say black ice can kill a driver if they're not careful. But after that night, I wonder if something more sinister waits in winter's darkness, waiting for travelers unlucky enough to stop. Urban deliveries rarely frightened me, but driving through the fringes of a large city at 2 a.m. can be its own horror show. This particular night, I had a drop-off scheduled near an industrial park on the city's outskirts. A labyrinth of overpasses and underpasses crisscrossed the roads, old graffiti marking every concrete pillar. GPS led me off the main expressway, guiding me beneath a towering overpass. My headlights swept across damp walls, revealing bizarre symbols sprayed in neon colors. The entire area felt deserted. No pedestrians, no passing cars, just the constant drip of water from the overhead structure. Halfway through the underpass, my truck stalled. No sputter, no mechanical warning, just dead. The electronics blinked, the engine light flickered, then silence. The smell of damp concrete wafted in through my slightly open window. A sudden pang of claustrophobia seized me. I tried the ignition. Nothing. Again, nothing. That's when I noticed shapes moving at the far edge of my peripheral vision, near the pillars. Could have been my imagination, but I sensed I wasn't alone. I locked my doors, adrenaline kicking in. Faint footsteps approached, echoing in the near-empty tunnel. A shrouded figure emerged from behind a support column, stepping carefully across puddles. My headlights were out, but the city glow behind him backlit his silhouette. He stopped about 15 feet away and just stood there, as though studying me. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. The figure edged closer. I could make out a hooded coat and a face mostly hidden in shadow. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, scraping motion across the concrete. Then, in a voice echoing strangely in the underpass, he said, "You're not supposed to be here." In panic, I turned the key again. The truck roared to life on that attempt, the sudden headlights illuminating the man. His features were unnaturally pale, eyes sunken, with dark hollows where cheekbones jutted out. Then, as if startled, he scurried back into the darkness. I wasted no time. Thrusting the truck into gear, I sped forward, out of the underpass, not caring if I scratched my trailer on the tight turn. Once I cleared the other side, the engine stabilized, the electronics returned to normal. In my side mirror, the man was a faint shape at the mouth of the tunnel. A mile later, I found a better lit main road. Only then did I realize I was drenched in sweat. I reported the incident to the local authorities, who claimed homeless people sometimes lived in those underpasses. But that didn't explain the intense feeling of dread, or how the truck's engine died without explanation, only to restart at the exact moment I needed it. That underpass, with its cryptic graffiti and ghostly occupant, still appears in my nightmares. I can't help but wonder if the warnings painted on the walls weren't just art, but a genuine attempt to ward off anyone who might stumble into a hidden underworld best left undisturbed. Small towns often have local legends. Usually they're about haunted houses or cryptid sightings in nearby woods. But one place off a rural route had a legend about a massive, centuries-old oak tree by the side of the road. They called it the Weeping Oak. It supposedly cried sap at midnight and was cursed by the spirit of a woman who died beneath its branches. I never put much faith in campfire tales, but after hauling livestock feed on a lonely route, I found myself driving past that very tree just before midnight. The moon was bright, bathing the oak in a silvery glow. Thick branches twisted overhead like skeletal arms. Something about the silhouette was off. As I slowed, I saw what looked like a pale figure standing at the base, leaning against the trunk. Initially, I thought it was a stranded motorist, but as my headlights washed over it, the figure vanished, gone in a blink. My chest tightened. Curiosity can be dangerous, but I couldn't resist. I parked on the shoulder, grabbed my flashlight, and approached. The air felt heavier near the oak, each step echoing with the crunch of dead leaves. The trunk was massive, gnarled with age. Some areas glistened with sap, thick and amber, dripping slowly as if the tree was bleeding. The wind picked up, rustling leaves overhead, and I could have sworn I heard a faint sobbing, like someone softly crying, carried on the breeze. My pulse quickened. The story about the weeping oak flickered in my mind. Suddenly, a droplet of sap fell onto my wrist. It was warm, almost hot, and carried the distinct smell of damp earth. Then, from behind the trunk, a figure emerged, translucent yet unmistakably shaped like a woman in old-fashioned attire. Her expression twisted in sorrow, tears flowing from empty eye sockets. I froze, a scream trapped in my throat. She raised a hand in a gesture that seemed like pleading. Then her lips moved, though no words came. Only that soft sobbing continued, echoing in my ears. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but a strange empathy tugged at me. The locals said she was the spirit of a betrayed lover, hung from the tree centuries ago, doomed to weep at midnight. Whether true or not, the grief radiating from her was palpable. Still, I couldn't remain. When I finally broke free of that paralyzing fear, I backed away, nearly dropping my flashlight. The figure didn't chase me. She just stood there, continuing her silent lament under the twisted branches. Once in my truck, I roared the engine to life and left without looking back. I told a few folks about it at the next truck stop. Some laughed it off, others nodded grimly. A local man admitted that on foggy nights, drivers report the same thing, seeing a sorrowful woman, hearing weeping in the wind. Since that night, I've avoided that rural route. If I can't, I make sure to pass by the weeping oak long before midnight. No matter what we rationalize, some places hold on to sorrow so deeply, it seeps into the living world. And that ancient oak, silently dripping amber tears, is living proof that some spirits never find peace. Long-haul routes sometimes force me to sleep in the most remote places. One night, after a mechanical delay, I had no choice but to park on a gravel turnout along a forgotten back road. No lights, no passing cars, just endless pine trees in every direction. I locked my cab, drew the curtains, and settled into the bunk, exhaustion overtaking caution. The engine's cooling ticked softly. Outside, crickets provided the only lullaby. At some point, I drifted into a fitful sleep. Then, in the dead of night, scritch, scratch. I jolted awake, heart pounding. It sounded like nails dragging across the metal door. My first assumption, maybe a bear or raccoon. Another scratch followed, gentler, almost probing. Scritch, like something testing the surface. Cautiously, I reached for a flashlight. Hand trembling, I slid into the driver's seat, parted the curtain just enough to peer outside. Darkness pressed against the glass. The reflection of my own face stared back, eyes wide. I turned on the flashlight, shining it onto the driver's side mirror. In that tiny reflection, I glimpsed movement. A silhouette ducked below the window. Scratch, the noise again, deliberate and slow. Fear prickled down my spine. I didn't want to open the door. Instead, I honked the horn, short bursts to scare off whatever it was. The sound blared into the night. For a moment, everything went still. No more scratching. Cautiously, I cracked open the window, shining the flashlight around. My breath froze. At the base of the door, I could see 4 deep scratches in the paint. Too large for a raccoon, too precise to be random claw marks. They formed a set of parallel lines about the length of a human hand. Then, from the other side of the truck, I heard a soft hiss, followed by a muffled thump. Something was circling me. My mind raced. Do I drive off blindly in the dark forest, risking a wreck? Or do I confront it? Summoning courage, I turned the ignition. The headlights sliced through the pitch black, revealing a figure hunched by the passenger side. It was vaguely human, but moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. The second my lights hit it, it darted into the trees, impossibly fast. I threw the truck into gear and took off, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop until I found a rural gas station miles away. Under its fluorescent lights, I inspected the door. 4 fresh gouges, each about half an inch deep, marred the metal. I spent the rest of the night awake, replaying the moment I saw that figure in the headlights. Wiry limbs, pale skin, a face I couldn't quite see. Even now, the memory of those nails scraping metal makes my blood run cold. I've learned that in the wilderness, not everything is a bear or a cougar. Sometimes, it's much, much worse. Route 22 was notorious for sharp turns and narrow lanes perched along a steep canyon. I'd heard stories of fatal crashes and ghost sightings, but the real danger, I believed, was overconfidence. One stormy afternoon, with thunderheads looming, I found myself hauling cargo up that treacherous road. Rain hammered my windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. I crawled at a snail's pace, peering through the downpour. Lightning streaked overhead, revealing jagged canyon walls. Then, through the sheets of rain, I noticed a sedan stopped ahead, hazard lights flashing. A man in a soaked jacket waved frantically. I pulled over carefully. He ran up to my window, desperation in his eyes. "My wife's in labor. We're stranded. My engine died," he said, voice trembling. I glanced at his car. Indeed, the passenger door was open, and I saw a pregnant woman leaning back, face contorted in pain. There was no cell signal here. No surprise with the storm. I offered them a ride to the next town's clinic, which was about 15 miles away. They climbed into the cab. I offered what little comfort I had, blankets, water. The woman's breathing was ragged, her contractions close. I was no midwife, but I knew time was short. As I continued up Route 22, the storm intensified. Rocks tumbled onto the road from the cliffs. Twice I had to swerve around debris. Every nerve was on alert, the treacherous path forcing me to keep both hands locked on the wheel. That's when something entirely unexpected happened. The cargo in my trailer shifted violently. The noise of crates toppling made the man jump and the woman cry out. I glanced at the mirror. All I could see was darkness and the flicker of overhead lights in the trailer. I tried to reassure them, focusing on the road. But a moment later, the trailer lurched again, as if something huge slammed from inside. My cargo wasn't anything special, just canned goods. So what was going on? The man asked if I needed to stop and check. The fear in his eyes was clear. He didn't want me to risk the baby's life or our own. But that slamming continued. Boom, boom, as though an invisible giant pounded the trailer walls. A hairpin turn forced my full attention. The wheels skidded, thunder roaring above us. Somehow I made it without plunging into the canyon. Another slam from the trailer nearly rocked us off center. The woman screamed, part terror, part labor pains. I pressed forward, adrenaline surging. A few minutes later, we reached the top of the canyon. The storm broke, revealing the lights of a small clinic in the distance. Relief flooded me. At the clinic, I helped them inside. Nurses rushed the couple away, and I managed to park in a safer area. Gathering my courage, I finally checked the trailer. Inside, the crates were everywhere, like a tornado had swept through. Cans were strewn about, and the steel walls bore fresh dents from the inside. But no sign of what caused the pounding. It didn't make sense. The crates themselves weren't heavy enough to create such force. All the latches were intact. I locked the trailer and drove on, mind spinning. Part of me wondered if something supernatural had been battling to escape, or if the chaotic drive made everything shift unpredictably. Weeks later, I got a thank you note from the couple. They named the baby after me, grateful for my help. But I still can't explain what happened in that trailer. Route 22 remains as dangerous as ever, but now I suspect there's more than meets the eye lurking along that winding canyon road. Sometimes a job leads to unusual loading sites. This one directed me to a salvage scrapyard at the edge of a derelict industrial district. My instructions: pick up a load of metal beams at midnight to avoid traffic. I arrived with caution, the chain-link gates squeaking as I rolled through. Towering piles of twisted metal cast eerie shadows under floodlights. The wind whistled between rusted car carcasses, creating a ghostly moan. No workers in sight. An old forklift sat near a disheveled office trailer. According to the client, they'd meet me here, but the place was deserted. I stepped out, scanning for movement. "Hello?" My voice echoed, unanswered. Then I heard a clang deeper in the yard. Possibly a loose sheet of metal slamming in the wind, I reasoned. Still, my nerves prickled. Walking between heaps of scrap, I noticed dark stains on the ground. Oil, maybe, or something else. The stench of decay hung in the air, unusual for a metal scrapyard. Another clang rang out, closer this time. I swung my flashlight beam in its direction. A silhouette disappeared behind a wrecked bus. It seemed human, but it moved oddly, hunched. I followed, heart pounding. Rounding the corner, I found nothing except a row of car doors stacked precariously. Suddenly, one door toppled over with a deafening crash. Instinctively, I jumped back, then a voice hissed from behind the bus, "Leave, now." My flashlight flickered. I aimed it, glimpsing a face, pale, gaunt, and feral. It vanished in a blink, leaving me rattled. Rushing back to my rig, I locked the doors. The forklift's headlights clicked on, shining straight at me, but nobody was in the driver's seat. I stared in disbelief as the forklift lurched forward, unstoppable. In desperation, I started my truck, reversed away from its path. The forklift kept coming, its engine squealing, metal forks scraping the concrete. I honked repeatedly, but no one responded. Seconds before collision, the forklift sputtered and died, headlights flickering off. Silence. My heart hammered like a jackhammer. Fighting the urge to flee, I realized I still needed those metal beams. My job was on the line. Summoning courage, I hopped down and approached the forklift. Its key wasn't even in the ignition. A chill ran through me as I realized it must have been started by someone, or something with other means. Abandoning caution, I decided to load the beams myself. I found them stacked on pallets near the gate. Sweat dripped down my brow as I worked quickly, anxious to leave this cursed place. The forklift, quiet now, loomed like a statue behind me. Just as I finished, a raspy whisper echoed from the shadows. "Get out before it's too late." I didn't argue. I secured the load, jumped in my cab, and barreled through the yard's exit, adrenaline roaring in my ears. By daylight, the yard looked ordinary enough when I drove back to double-check my route. Workers milled about, acting like nothing was wrong. They claimed they never work overnight. No forklift operator was scheduled. Confusion churned in my mind, but I kept my mouth shut, not wanting to sound deranged. I still deliver in that district, but never again do I agree to a midnight pickup at that scrapyard. Whatever prowls there after dark, be it vagrants, criminals, or something more sinister, it made one thing very clear. That place is alive with restless spirits and haunted machinery, ready to terrorize any unfortunate soul who trespasses under the moonlight. Fog can be serene, but it can also hide horrors. One early morning, I drove along a coastal highway famous for its thick blankets of mist. Visibility was near zero. My high beams created a white wall, so I switched to low and inched along. In the haze, I barely noticed the silhouette of a person stumbling onto the road. I slammed the brakes, stopping just short. A young man in tattered clothes, drenched from the moisture, waved at me frantically. I rolled down the window. He was breathless, eyes wild. "Help me, please," he gasped. "They're after me." I glanced around, seeing only swirling fog. "Who's after you?" He just shook his head, begging to get in. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. He slumped into the seat, shivering. As I started driving, I asked him what was going on. He mumbled about escaping a compound, something about a cult hidden in the coastal hills. It sounded far-fetched, but his terror seemed genuine. My plan was to get him to the nearest town, but within minutes we both noticed shapes flitting through the fog. Figures, multiple, sprinting along the roadside, keeping pace with my truck. How was that possible? Panic surged. I pressed the accelerator, but the road was winding and slick. The man gripped the dashboard, urging me to go faster. Those silhouettes darted in and out of view, occasionally passing in front of my headlights. Human forms, but unnaturally quick. He shouted, "They can't let me leave. Please don't stop." A jolt rocked the truck as if someone jumped onto the back. I heard thumps on the trailer doors. My passenger shrank in his seat, hyperventilating. Another shape sprinted alongside the cab, face turned toward us. I only saw a glimpse, eyes wide, mouth contorted in an unearthly grin. Maintaining control was a nightmare. Sharp curves loomed out of nowhere, the fog erasing every landmark. The trailer swayed dangerously. Thumping continued, now on the roof. I flashed back to stories of roaming cults that performed bizarre rituals out here. Or maybe these were something else entirely, creatures using the cloak of fog. Suddenly, the road descended, twisting down the cliffside. I had to slow to avoid a deadly plunge. The banging on the roof escalated, fists pounding metal. My passenger screamed, bracing himself. At the final curve, the shapes retreated, as if some invisible boundary prevented them from going further. The pounding ceased. I risked a glance at the side mirror. Only swirling fog remained. We reached a small fishing town at sunrise. The man thanked me, tears in his eyes. He refused to call the police, muttering about infiltration that they wouldn't believe him. He slipped away before I could protest. I never saw him again, but I remember the terror in his voice. Whether it was a cult or something more supernatural, those figures in the fog were real enough to haunt my dreams. Even now, driving that coastal highway under low visibility sets my nerves on edge. Every swirl in the mist becomes a potential pursuer, waiting to reclaim what fled their hidden domain. Sometimes, you find yourself carrying unusual freight, but nothing prepared me for a request to transport a sealed historical artifact from a private estate to a remote museum. The instructions were strict. Do not open the container under any circumstance. I arrived at the estate, greeted by grim-faced staff who loaded a large coffin-like crate into my trailer. No forklift, just a team of men in black suits straining under its weight. One whispered, "God help us all," as they secured it. En route, I felt uneasy. Something about that crate radiated menace. The miles dragged on. Late into the night, on a deserted stretch of highway, I heard a dull thump from inside the trailer. Then another. My imagination? Or was the cargo shifting? Pulled over, I opened the trailer doors, flashlights in hand. The crate was intact, the straps still tight, but scratch marks now marred the inside walls of the trailer. Long, deep gouges. I recoiled. Even if the crate slid, it wouldn't create such marks. It looked more like claws. Against explicit orders, I pressed an ear to the crate's surface. My heart nearly stopped when I heard a faint scraping from within, like nails on wood. Every rational thought told me to seal the doors and drive. But fear has a way of skewing logic. Back in the cab, I locked everything, determined to finish the run. An hour later, it got worse. The trailer's temperature gauge plummeted, dropping well below freezing. My breath fogged the air inside the cab. The radio died, replaced by static that occasionally formed hushed whispers. My name, repeated over and over. Headlights appeared in my mirror, a single car pursuing at high speed. It pulled alongside, a black sedan. Its passenger window rolled down, revealing a woman gesturing for me to stop. She mouthed something I couldn't decipher. Then, in a flash, the sedan swerved behind me and disappeared. No taillights, no sign of an accident, gone as if it vanished into thin air. The crate's thumping grew frantic. For a moment, I thought it might burst open. I floored it, desperation fueling me. When I finally reached the museum, staff were waiting, their faces grim. They carefully unloaded the crate. One older man, presumably the curator, placed a rosary on it. He avoided my eyes as he said, "Your job is done. Go, now." And I did. I never asked questions, never learned the artifact's true nature. But a week later, news broke that the remote museum experienced a catastrophic fire with no survivors. The artifact was presumed destroyed. Still, I have nightmares imagining that crate's occupant or presence escaping the flames. Certain secrets, I realized, lie buried for good reason. The Great Salt Flats are an otherworldly place, flat and endless, reflecting the sky like a mirror when wet. I had a delivery to a research station perched at the far edge of the flats. Locals warned me never to stray from marked routes. The crust can be deceptive. Beneath its surface, a quagmire of mud can swallow vehicles whole. My GPS directed me onto a lonely access road. Miles of white salt stretched in every direction. It felt like driving on a gleaming alien planet. Halfway in, the wind kicked up. Dust devils spun across the flats. Then, just my luck, a mechanical fault forced me to pull over. The engine hissed, spitting steam. I stepped out, assaulted by salt-laden air that stunned my eyes. I popped the hood, tinkering. Suddenly the wind died. The hush was surreal. My ears rang in the silence. That's when I heard it, a distant drumming like footsteps on a hollow floor. Scanning the horizon, I saw no one, just shimmering heat waves. Then, the ground beneath me pulsed, a faint vibration. The drumming got louder, as if rising from underground. Heart hammering, I realized the salt crust was trembling. Fear gripped me. Was this an earthquake? Or something else? I turned to find footprints, perfectly formed, leading away from my truck, even though I stood alone. They appeared fresh, pressed into the salt. My mind scrambled for an explanation. The footprints seemed to lead to a shadow in the distance. Against my better judgment, I followed. Each step crunched the salt, my boots sinking slightly. The drumming intensified, resonating through my bones. A shape materialized, a figure stooped on hands and knees, as if clawing at the salt. I froze, uncertain if I was hallucinating. The figure's head whipped around, revealing hollow eye sockets. It let out a shriek that reverberated across the flats, then sank through the salt as though the crust turned to quicksand beneath it. Every fiber of my being screamed to get back to the truck. Sprinting across the brittle surface, I nearly tripped several times as the ground gave slightly. Adrenaline surged. The engine was still hot, but I cranked it. By some miracle, it roared awake. I tore away, ignoring the risk of sinking, praying the crust would hold. In my mirror, that spot where the figure vanished was marked by swirling salt dust, rising like a specter. The drumming subsided as I hit stable ground. When I reached the research station, I tried to warn them. They exchanged uneasy glances. One scientist confided that ancient native legends spoke of spirits trapped beneath the salt, drumming for release. My experience left me shaken, convinced there's truth to those stories. Even now, the memory of footprints appearing beside me and that hollow-faced figure keeps me far away from the salt flats whenever possible. Some places are simply not meant for the living. After a double shift hauling produce, I needed real rest, an actual bed, not just the bunk in my rig. Near the state line, I found a dinky roadside motel advertising cheap rooms. It looked old, neon sign flickering, but I was beyond picky. The lobby was empty except for a bell on the counter. A bored clerk finally appeared, handed me a key without a word. Room 103, ground floor. The hall smelled of mildew and old carpet, flickering lights, typical cheap motel. Inside, the room was passable. A bed, a tiny TV, a single lamp. Exhausted, I locked the door, set my duffel down, and collapsed onto the mattress. As soon as I closed my eyes, though, I heard whispering, like multiple voices in conversation just outside my door. I checked the peephole. The corridor was dark, empty, but I could still hear the murmur. A chill ran through me. Maybe it was thin walls and some late-night talk show from the next room. I tried to ignore it. Minutes later, the lamp flickered. The TV turned on by itself, static crackling. I reached for the remote, dead batteries. The TV shut off on its own. The whispering resumed, now inside the room. I jolted upright, heart racing. No one was there. I rushed to the door, intending to complain to the clerk. The handle wouldn't budge. It felt like it was chained from the outside, but there was no chain on this side. A swell of panic rose. I banged on the door, shouting, "Hey, is anyone out there?" Silence. Then, from behind me, a voice hissed, "Don't leave." I spun around. The lamp's glow revealed a shadow by the closet, a shape roughly human but wavering. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow drifted closer, the whispering intensifying as if many voices spoke in unison. My back pressed against the door, mind racing for an escape. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged for the window. It slid open with surprising ease. I dove through, landing awkwardly in the motel's rear lot, scraping my arms on gravel. Shaken and panting, I sprinted around the building to the front lobby. No clerk. The entire place was abandoned. Even the neon sign was off, as if it never had power to begin with. My rig was still parked out front, so I jumped in and sped away, not caring about a refund or my duffel bag left behind. I never found that motel again. Later, other drivers told me no motel has operated at that location in decades. The building was condemned, possibly demolished years ago after a fire. Yet I swore I checked in, had a key, even saw the clerk. I can't explain it, but the experience left me certain some illusions linger in deserted places. Traps for the weary traveler. Whenever I pass that stretch of highway at night, I fight the urge to look for a flickering neon sign. I remind myself, keep driving, because if I stop, I might never escape that lonely motel's spectral invitation again.